as well. Some audiences are watching from online, I can see. Thank you so much all for gathering here today. This is the third talk event of our exhibition called Ground Zero. I'm going to share screen a little bit because I can see that not all the people are in Kyoto right now, and not all the people can see our exhibition in person. So I'd like to start with a little bit of brief introduction of our exhibition, and then we can, today we have a pleasure of welcoming Susan as our guest speaker, so we'll proceed to Susan's presentation. Okay, I'm gonna introduce myself. I'm Erin Masuda. I'm the curator of this exhibition, Ground Zero. And yeah, so we've been doing an exhibition from the beginning of November. It's been already 1 month and a half, and also we have still 10 days or so left. The title, Ground Zero, the term is often used to describe a site of nuclear explosion or rocket explosion originally, but especially after Manhattan Project, it's been used to describe a kind of like the loss of idealized futurity that was supposed to be brought by the development of technology, or a kind of like a site of nothingness that came at the cost of it. And another very important term that I want to introduce in this when I describe this exhibition is called geotrauma. So while the term trauma refers to a psychological trauma of human beings, geotrauma refers to a trauma of like certain ecological community, which includes human, animals, and like many existences beyond. So considering what has been happening around Russian and Ukrainian, or like the venicity of these areas as a contemporary site of Ground Zero, we as an artist and researcher collective, we try to speculate a way that we can kind of collectively share or care this kind of geotrauma that's been caused around it. So that's the brief concept of our exhibition. In Kyoto Art Center, we have 2 galleries. One's this one, it's the south one, and we have north one as well. And yeah, we have 5 artists from many different countries. I'm originally from Tokyo, but currently living in Berlin. Iden's also from Germany. Also Vivian's, she's a Chinese American artist. Also Yamagata-san and Narisada-san from Tokyo as well. So we've been engaged in a research together for almost like 6 months, and we've been to trip to Fukushima nuclear power plant together as well. So we envision this exhibition to be a series of consecutive different kinds of events, such as workshops and talks and exhibitions and so on, also research trips. Yeah, that's what's been happening so far. So as I said, today is the third talk event. For the first talk, we invited Taro Igarashi-san, who is the architectural critique, and we've kind of discussed about the limitations and possibilities of current trends of investigative artistic practices. And last week we had Lucia Pietrosti as a guest speaker. We discussed the concept surrounding a geotrauma, and today we have Susan here to talk about the concept of material witness. So thank you so much for coming here today, Susan.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's good to have a little bit of a sense of the context, for sure.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, maybe then we can proceed to to the introduction of your practices or your presentation.
Sounds good. Okay. Great. Yeah, I'll need to get into share screen myself then.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to stop sharing screens. There you go, yeah.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, obviously I can't really see who's in the room, and but thank you for the invitation, and I really look forward to the discussion. And just to say, maybe by way of introduction, I'm going to play a keynote, and I will talk over and through that. So And because I'm really going to foreground this presentation in my creative practice, which is largely documentary film, although writing plays a key role. So many of the works that I do also sync up directly with the research. Well, they do sync up very directly with the research that I'm doing, but oftentimes I will be both writing about a case study, but then producing a documentary alongside that. So that tends to be my practice, is using the space of writing as a space of critical reflection, and then through my artistic documentary practice, that's really the opportunity to tell a story. So it's less about unpacking a case. Let me share screen and we will start. And I will share sound. So I decided to, does that work for everybody? You can see my first slide, which I called Earth Evidence.
Yeah,
correct?
perfectly. Yeah, it's been projected onto a screen. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. It's funny, I don't see the, let me just try and get rid of some of these. My cursor doesn't really work. You've mentioned the book Material Witness, and I'm actually going to start with that and to really kind of explain what that book is about. And this is just a video flipping through the pages of the book. But the book Material Witness tries to look at the ways in which materials register evidence of events. In my case, the evidence that was often evidence relating to conflict, war, sometimes war crimes. So there's quite a few cases in the book that look at the former conflict in the Balkans and the International Criminal Tribunal that proceeded out of that context. So material witness, I'm taking a legal term that already exists, and I'm moving it into a different conceptual framework. So in the book, I make this argument for the ways in which materials both register evidence of events, but also I examine the event of evidence. And the event of evidence for me is when certain kinds of materials start to enter into various forums. And the forum, of course, is also very important for forensic architecture. So when materials enter into different institutional contexts and start to be disputed and debated, and in the book, these tended to be legal trials, though not exclusively. But so we have to think about material witness as doing two things, is both providing evidence of events and also providing insight into the event of evidence, the ways in which evidence starts to matter or doesn't matter in different international or domestic legal forums, or they could be people's tribunals, et cetera, or even the forums of public opinion. I'm going to stop that book from moving. I actually do write 3 chapters in the book that deal with nuclear evidence. And you can see that this image on the screen, which comes from the gamma camera that was used, that was developed by Toshiba. Specifically, it's a portable gamma camera. So the gamma camera is a technology that already exists in hospitals, etc. But after the nuclear accident at Fukushima Daiichi, Toshiba invents this portable camera. And I actually share a clip of the use of it in the field, and then the ways in which I then used it in my documentary film that I produced. I was very interested in this camera, and it's the reason I also used it on the cover of my book, Material Witness. If I were to go back, you can that's actually the cover of the book. And that's an image inside the core of the reactor. And also as an architect, what's really interested about this kind of image is the fact that it's unlike the Geiger counter, which I'm sure you've heard, the kind of like the clicking noise of the Geiger counter that historically been used to monitor the presence of radioactivity. This camera really, and the kind of sensor that's used, the gamma sensor, really allows you to have a spatial understanding of contamination. And that becomes kind of very important for the arguments that I've tried to make in all of my artwork, because I'm really looking at the ways in which environments hold traces of things. So oftentimes that would be contaminants, pollutants, etc. So how are environmental systems carrying traces, and how can we read, analyze, understand, represent these contaminating conditions in large-scale environmental systems? So towards the end of the book, Material Witness, I've really moved from classical pieces of evidence like documents, photographs, film and video. By the end of the book, I'm looking at environmental systems themselves as a kind of media that is recording information. In the chapter that deals with Sri Lanka and the multi-decade war that unfolded in Sri Lanka, I was very interested in the sort of ways in which the scars of landscape hold traces of the war that we can still sort of read even in the aftermath of that sort of conflict. But let me just give you, this might be familiar to people, but it's a clip that shows the ways in which this gamma camera has now been used by scientists in the field to do sort of large-scale environmental monitoring of radioactive contaminants. So let me play that. Sorry, just give me a moment.
One scientist involved in these investigations is Satoshi Mori. Mori and his team use a special camera that can show a visualization of the radiation dose. The areas with the highest levels appear in red. It's clear the amount of radiation near the ground is particularly high. Hotspots with exceptionally high levels of radiation are scattered throughout the forest.
And now I will share a clip from the documentary that I produced called Trace Evidence, and it looks at 3 incidents in which nuclear evidence of one kind or another appeared. But the short clip that I'm going to share now just gives you some insight into the ways in which I try to work with this sort of work with the gamma camera. I wasn't actually using a gamma camera because it was impossible to, as much as I tried borrow, but I tried to basically represent the operations of the gamma camera. And this is in the final, comes from the final chapter of the Trace Evidence trilogy, where I was exploring the ways in which radioactive isotopes from Japan moved all the way to the west coast of Canada many, many years later. And let me play that now for you. And this section's called Hydrology. This is the silent webcam footage, silent webcam footage, and then I'm now adding my own sound design.
The release of radioactive materials into the air and water had begun. While Chernobyl's fallout would eventually spread across extensive tracts of arable land throughout Europe, Fukushima's contamination seems to have traveled further still, crossing some 7,600 kilometers through the vast microbial channels of the Pacific, reaching the western shores of British Columbia many years later.
Scientists say that traces of radioactivity from the nuclear accident in Japan 4 years ago have washed up on Canada's coastline. It's the first time they've detected materials from the accident in North America, but they say the amounts don't pose a threat to living creatures.
Yeah, so in that short clip, you can just see the way I'm trying to, and this is an early work, what I'm trying to do is in some way render into perceptibility, so both visually and auditorily, through the production of a sound design, some sort of latent condition in the environment. So even though there's nothing to see, when you look at that coastline of British Columbia, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, you don't see contamination, you don't necessarily see pollutants. So I had to use other sort of audiovisual strategies to tell that story, that there was something strange happening in these compromised environments. This kind of thinking has led me to a very long-term research project called Learning from Ice that I'm still engaged with, and that project has resulted. I was looking at the sort of body of work. I think I produced thus far 9 documentaries in relationship to this research project. Some of them quite sort of small, sort of more essay films, and other sort of more major investigative kind of documentaries and research projects. But Learning from Ice really tries to look and research, investigate, and look at the different knowledge practices that are mediated by an engagement with the material world, and in this case, ice. And I grew up in very cold climates, and so I was very used to the fact that ice is a very domesticated, familiar material, certainly within the context of Canada, but it's also, unlike something like a radioactive isotope, which is a very radical kind of, we would argue that's a quite a radical kind of it's not material. Sorry, let me explain. I wanted to work with ice because I had felt that the nuclear, my engagement with nuclear kind of evidence and nuclear sort of materials, in as much as, we live in a radiological world, there's, every time we have a dental x-ray or fly in a plane, of course, we're interacting with various levels of radiation, but nonetheless, it still seems like a very kind of sort of radical condition to be working with, reflecting on radioactive materials and the environmental systems, whereas I thought ice was something that was so kind of familiar to so many different people in various sort of contexts, very ordinary, but it could also produce quite extraordinary insight. So I started to work with what I thought was a more kind of everyday material and an everyday encounter with that could somehow help me tell these very complicated stories that I wanted to tell in relationship to both scientists that work with ice and also affected communities that are living with the conditions of global warming and the retreat and diminishment of the world's glaciers. So the project actually begins in the Canadian Ice Core Archive, and what we're looking at here on the screen is an ice core. And as the subtitle says, you can see this cloudy layer very clearly. So an ice core is a meter-long section of ice that is drilled with something that would resemble sort of classical geological kind of drilling equipment, but in this case, it's drilled and pulled out of the ice sheets, notably Antarctica, Greenland, and the Arctic. This is an Antarctic ice core, and we can see very clearly with our eyes. We don't have to do any chemical analysis to see that the annual layers of snowfall really carry different kinds of materials that have made their way into the atmosphere. So volcanic ash is what we can see right here. So every time it snows, anything that's in the atmosphere is archived within the snow crystals that slowly compress to form ice. And the ice core record that we can now access by drilling and extracting cores from Antarctica goes back more than 1 million years. So we can get a very detailed, what scientists say is the highest resolution data set of environmental change from an ice core, because there are there might be hundreds of snowstorms in a given year, and each snowstorm captures atmospheric evidence. That is to say, it holds trace evidence of whatever happens to be in the atmosphere at that time. And so this is why ice cores have been incredibly important for building the global climate model, but allowing scientists to make the really important claim that the Earth's atmosphere has been warming dramatically over the last 200 years. Since the time of industrialization, we can see a dramatic rise in particular of CO2 and methane gas. And here we have scientists actually working on the core. So once the core is extracted, it goes into an ice core archive, and then various bits and pieces of ice can be studied, can be shipped to colleagues around the world, etc. There's not many ice core archives in the world. There is one in Japan that I'm aware of. There's one in Canada, the United States, Copenhagen, India, and maybe a few others. So scientists really need to share these ice samples. So I began this project in the Canadian Ice Core Archive, which contains cores from the 1970s predominantly. And it's the cores that are in the Canadian Ice Core Archive are extracted in a very manual way. It's not the big operations of Antarctica. So I'll play a clip from the very end of the documentary that just gives you a little bit of insight into the ways in which scientists are extracting cores from ice and then to be shipped south to various labs, mostly labs where they do sort of chemical work. So the ice core, once it goes into a lab, usually has to be melted or crushed. Basically, the sample needs to be destroyed so you can get the data out of it. And the thing that's important to pay attention to in this clip, you'll start to see the way that so music and sound have become very useful for me to try and shift in some way the perceptual registers and maybe sort of push a project into a more conceptual domain to sort of take it out of the sort of more standard sort of kind of documentary mode. So let me just play this clip, which comes at the very end of an hour-long film about the ice core archive and the labs that study ice cores. I'm going to stop it there because for purposes of time. So at the end, they're pulling out this, as I said, this meter-long core. Now, you can see that's a very manual operation. In Antarctica, where they're pulling out cores like that go back, that are 7 kilometers in length, you're pulling them up one by one to take one ice core out. So one vertical column that goes all the way down to bedrock will take about 5 years because you're only taking it out in meter-long sections. So of course in Antarctica, there's a lot more kind of heavy equipment involved, but the principle is exactly the same. You take one section out and then you put the drill back in, then you take another one out, and you do that over the course of 7 kilometers. But as I said, music and sound are really important to my practice. And there we have an electronic sounds, basically musical composition that's been produced. And so what I've been trying to do is work with music, but then also I do a lot of field recordings. The last project I didn't want to introduce any sort of electronic sounds. I wanted to just push the soundscape to tell viewers or alert viewers that something else was happening. So the sonic strategies have varied between different projects, from very environmental sort of scores to something that's maybe a bit more subtle. Just to give you a sense of a couple of the project I'm working on now, this is a project called Signals from Svalbard, and Svalbard is in the Arctic region, and it's an archipelago shared by Norway and Russia, and it's largely a site of scientific infrastructures, although it has a kind of permanent community that lives there, and it has a lot of nowadays ecotourism. In the past, there was coal mining that happened there, and it's the site of the global seed vault, so which some of you might be aware of. But I'm working on a project called Signals from Svalbard. So this project, what I'm trying to do is, what I've done rather, is I've shot footage at all of the different infrastructures for the technical observation of the environment. So that could be atmospheric, it could be geological, it could be the amount of snowfall, etc. But what I've been really trying to do with this project is somehow denaturalize this northern geography. So oftentimes when you see images of the north, you would see these sort of an image like this, but without all of the technological infrastructure. So sky, snow, sometimes water. And my experience of doing field work in the Arctic has been that despite my awareness that there's a lot of things going on in these environments, including in the case of Svalbard, the nuclear fleets of Britain and Russia are moving under Arctic sea ice, but we never, we don't have access to the kind of geopolitics that is moving through these contexts. This is the satellite ground station called Svalsat, which is the world's biggest ground station and the most northerly ground station. So it has 100 of these pods, inside of which are antennas, and they're downloading all the data from Earth orbiting satellites, Landsat, et cetera, et cetera. So, so there's a lot also happening, let's say within the electromagnetic spectrum as well, that we also don't have access to because we don't perceive that kind of sort of phenomena. So this project is really about exploring the kind of techno infrastructures that are completely saturated on an Arctic archipelago like Svalbard, and also to sort of counter the other kinds of representations that we often see of these kinds of spaces in terms of like animal life, whales, polar bears, this kind of thing, and just to focus and to really push home the idea that the North, the circumpolar North in particular, has become this incredibly, is an incredibly politicized space. It's largely, it's underpopulated, or there's not that many people living in the circumpolar North. So military operations, intelligence gathering, all kinds of things are taking place there. Here's the undersea cable that links Svalbard to the sort of mainland. So it's really a project that's trying to produce another image of these kinds of transformative, what are called cryospheric geographies, moving away from the kind of like David Attenborough Planet Earth kind of image of the sort of frozen planet, to look at the ways in which these spaces are completely, as I say, not only saturated with politics, but the site of a lot of techno-military kind of mobilizations and operations. And so the Signals from Svalbard is really trying to tune into this other kind of set of practices that are happening there, which unless you're looking and filming an actual infrastructure, you don't always, you're not necessarily aware of. But enough about that. I wanted to take my last few minutes to talk about, let me get to my next slide if I can. Yeah, to talk about a project that is still ongoing, which is this project Listening to Ice, where I spent time with a group of scientists in the Himalayas. We were using a lot of the conventional tools of the physical sciences to monitor glacial change at Drangdrung Glacier. So here we have this is just a quick synopsis of different things that we were doing at this glacier. There I am actually paddling a boat because I'm going to be deploying a long-term acoustic sensor into the lake at the mouth of the glacier. So Listening to Ice was trying to understand climate change through the acoustic register from the use of technical sensors, hydrophones, listening to stories from communities and elders about what had been going on in their environment, running listening workshops. This is images from a workshop that we held with a local group of mountain villagers, mostly women. So really trying to understand climate change, as I said, through practices of listening, from technical scientific listening to other modes of the embodied experiences of being in a location and listening to our ears, but with our ears. So, but also listening and hearing the stories of communities that are affected by climate change. The reason that this is really important is that when scientists go to different contexts to do technical work, sometimes they will engage with local communities. If in Canada, they would be required to do so, and they would be required to ask for permission to work on the land of Indigenous peoples. It doesn't always mean that the interactions with local communities are necessarily sustained. It might simply be a case of ticking boxes on a form, making sure, yes, you've consulted with local communities, you explained your projects. In some cases, scientists will go into schools and spend time with people talking about why the work is important. But we thought with this particular project of Listening to Ice, because we were a very interdisciplinary team from community grassroots organizations, students, scientists, local mountain villagers, we thought it was really important to not just communicate, say what we were doing to the local people that lived in the environment and whose very lives were completely dependent on this glacier, but to see, could science itself produce conditions of hospitality? Could we bring people into the process of listening to this glacier? So of course we were listening for and doing long-term recordings for a different purpose, not just to have a sense of the sort of incredible acoustic dynamics of ice, but could science produce conditions of hospitality? So here we have a woman from the local community who's got headphones on, and she's listening to a hydrophone that we put into the crevice of a glacier. And she's hearing all these crackling and popping sounds of this subterranean sort of movement of ice. And it's opening up this whole world that you can't necessarily see when you're on the surface of ice. And we were thinking that this was, by running these kind of workshops, we could bring local people into science. So even though we're not necessarily, in this case, listening to ice for the purposes of collecting data and then understanding that data, nonetheless, it was much more about creating an experience of what was at stake in the science, rather than simply trying to communicate to locals, this is what we're doing and this is why it's important. which is the kind of this is the kind of standard sort of methodology. And we began our day simply by placing our ears to these moulins, which are these small, almost like they're holes that are drilled by water that go deep down into the ice, and they can really funnel sound in an interesting way. So if you place your ear to a moulin, you can also just start to hear the movement and crackling and popping of ice without using any kind of microphone technology. So we began the day like that. So as my projects are developing, I'm also trying to develop different methodologies of engaging with a much broader range of we could call them stakeholders. So it's not simply working with scientists, it's trying to work with local communities, activists, grassroots organizations, schools. So the next thing that I will be doing is running a workshop in northern Canada in April in Nunavut, working with Inuit youth on an acoustic mapping project. So to me, this is really important that in working with materials in the material world, is how do we bring sort of multiple perspectives into interaction with each other? How do we begin to learn? How do scientists learn from locals who have intergenerational or multi-decade knowledge of changes in their environments? How do local communities, how are they given access to some of the work that scientists are doing? And yeah, I think I'm just going to wrap up with just maybe talking about this very small project that came out of some of this work, which is a vinyl album that was commissioned by Beck in Norway last year, or maybe it was this year. I can't remember. I think it came out earlier. Yeah, it came out sort of in maybe February of this year. And it's a vinyl album that I had pressed to look like a chunk of ice. And it has a lot of the field recordings that I've done, but also field recordings that others have done and shared with me. In one case, Martin Sharp, who's one of the scientists that I met at the Canadian Ice Core Archive, he gave me a recording that he did in 1999, and it's a recording of the Belcher Glacier in northern Canada that was melting at a dramatic rate. And Martin said he did that recording, and then he played that recording at the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So he did a field recording capturing the kind of material, expressive nature and conditions of this melting glacier. And then he played that recording in this International Climate Change Forum. And I asked him why he did that. And he just felt that when you go to these large kind of multi-state, big scientific kind of forums and conventions where climate policy is being debated and drafted, that they're always just talking about data and data sets and Excel spreadsheets, etc. And even as a scientist, he wanted to somehow situate the people that were in the room, to somehow bring them closer to the context in which these changes were taking place, and to really produce a kind of like a sort of a sensorial experience of what it means to be working in these kind of transformative environments, and somehow break through the kind of, we could almost say the sort of tyranny of data that really organizes the debates within these global climate forums. So Martin has captured a recording that of the material evidence of the changes taking place within this glacier. So this acoustic recording that, in my words, would also be like a material witness to climate change. And then he is actually bringing it in to the forum where climate change is being discussed, and he's he's playing that there almost as an intervention that's in some way trying to trouble or problematize the ways in which scientists are, to a large degree, compelled to represent the environments in which they work through these kind of, largely through the sort of register or through the sort of framework of kind of data. So how do you bring a more kind of effectual, experiential kind of set of materials into these kind of public forums? So Martin's recording is also on this album. And then also on the B side, there is a musical composition that I commissioned from by this Beirut-based musician called Mohammed Safa, and he produced a score for an early piece that I shot in the Svalbard Arctic archipelago. That's a sort of forerunner to the signals from Svalbard. So side A is all field recordings from many different glaciers that I've worked at, and also recordings from given to me by scientists who've also worked on different sort of glacial field sites. And then side B is this is the musical score to a film. And so it was really nice to work on an actual, to produce an analog, to produce an object that also, you know, as you can see in that picture, there's something about wanting to produce something that had a kind of concrete tangibility, because so many of the materials I'm producing in my like film and audio visual practice they're digital recordings, they're you know, they're always shared as digital files, etc. So I also wanted to have some aspect of this project that somehow brought us back to the material world, even though I know it's basically a piece of sort of polymer plastic that's been pressed to look like a chunk of ice. And I'm sure we could debate the fact that these kind of vinyl records are coming out of a certain kind of extractivist, of course, economy in and of itself. But I thought it was nice by the end of this presentation to somehow at least gesture to the sort of material world through the kind of production of a material object that I felt was important in relationship to the ways in which so much of the documentation of these, we could say, traumatized sort of landscapes are being done entirely through kind of digital means. But maybe this is a good time just to leave it there. I think that's enough sort of of me chatting and showing to give us a sense of what's at stake in some of these recent projects. Let me see if I can stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation, Susan. I was really, I think it was very insightful, especially to see how this kind of like investigative quality of your research could actually lead to something so poetic and affective, sometimes sensual as an object. And I was very, like, I think when I read your book, I always felt it is very like structurally, theoretically, very much like in a way it's settled, but at the same time there's this kind of playfulness that I could see in it, or this kind of like embodiment or collaborative effort that you put into your work was very, very, very insightful for me. And I was wondering if there's any questions, or I think one artist has a question. Would that be okay if she asks right now?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is it in the chat or where is it?
No, she's here. She has a mic here, so.
I'm here.
Okay, great. It'd be great to see, because all I'm seeing is this icon. Who's speaking?
Can you see our like the video that's like shown in the screen, or like no?
I can see maybe I'll pin that. So, I can see. Okay, now I see it. Yeah, okay, so I see
Good to see you,
people in
Susan.
front of their laptops. Yeah.
Good to see you, Susan. Here is Iden, and it's good to see you again after a few years in Kai School with Susanne Kiemann.
Yeah.
And I have a question in terms of history writing and knowledge building. You have followed scientific witnessing and investigation and experiment for a long time, and have exhibited your films consisting of collected documentary footage as ecological testimony, and also sound fragments from Geiger counter as geographical witnessing. And in the context of canonical history writing and knowledge building in ecological discourse, how would you elaborate and position your artistic practice and approach specifically in your project with eyes?
So how would I position that in relationship to, what did you say, canonical?
History writing.
History writing. Okay, wow. I don't think I've ever thought about that question in those terms. I mean, maybe it'd be good to hear a bit more from you, because what do you see as a sort of canonical history writing? Like, how would you understand that?
Oh, actually, that is also from the publication 10%, which where I also contributed. And you quote here a note on scientific caption, maybe I can read it, a fiction that has the ambition of being part of science is not just one fiction among others. Its vocation is to transform the collective, and even more accurately to create a new collective, which is to say also in the socially new type of history. And I was quite impressed that you mentioned here about a new type of history, and I want to hear about your practice in the history writing.
Okay. I mean, I think the way that I really talk about it also, I would say within the Material Witness book, is really about, like, I see my work as like producing a kind of another version of events. So it's not about, like, let me answer this way. Like, in the Center for Research Architecture and also Forensic Architecture, a lot of what we have done and what the students have done is produce these counter investigations or counter claims, right? Overturning let's say the state narrative or the dominant sort of narrative. That's a very common strategy that we tend to use. It's to call into question or dispute a kind of given version of events. So in the case of forensic architecture, it's very common for the police or the authorities to have one version of events that is the accepted version, and then forensic architecture's investigation actually might show the ways in which the police have lied, etc., or they've, produced a false sort of narrative. So this counter move is very dominant in the center and in forensic architecture. In my work, I don't really take quite that sort of oppositional stance, and I tend to see my work as making a contribution to a field, in the sense that there's multiple stories that are circulating, and it's about, like, how do you tell a story that complicates, and maybe whose operations aren't simply to overturn one story and replace it with a new kind of like history, but rather to see how are all of these different stories operating in tension with each other. That tends to be the ways that I would see my work. And so when it comes to ice, we can think of many examples where artists who say focus on melting ice and the retreat of glaciers and the collapse of ice sheets will tend to produce a melancholic kind of response. Like, the melting of ice produces a melancholia, this world that is disappearing literally in front of us. Like, I remember when Olafur Eliasson had this big chunk of ice that was brought from I can't remember, I think it was Greenland to Tate Modern, and you could put your hand on it, and you, in some way, this sort of empathy that you could, like by touching, feeling this thing that is literally disappearing, melting as you hold your hand to it. The only kind of response I think you could have would be one of loss and melancholia for a world that is disappearing and will be no more. That is fine, but to me that's one register only. I'm trying to tell different kinds of stories about the people who live and work with ice, whether that's communities or scientists. How are they working with this material? What's their relationship to it? What are the practices of care that are mobilized or activated in relationship to ice? And I'm not that interested in staying in this melancholic mode of loss, because I don't think that's going to actually get us anywhere. It might be a kind of moment of empathy. So to me, about this sort of, when we try and think about what are the new histories or the new stories that one wants to sort of tell, to me it's about sort of enlarging, or maybe telling, being kind of, in my case, I like to think about my work as polyperspectival, producing many different entry points, but reflections, and trying to, this is when I say I'm trying to tell a complicated story. I'm trying to use ice as a mediator between many different sort of worlds, and to try and tell this sort of complex set of stories. So not just a singular story that's trying to overturn a prevailing kind of accepted truth or claim, etc. So yeah, that's the way I think I would have to respond to your question, is about how do you produce a narrative or craft a new set of relationships that are operating in tension amongst all of the existing versions that are already kind of operating.
So beautiful answer. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a great question, and it's always amazing to be asked something that where you go like, I haven't thought about it exactly in that way.
I was also a bit confused when I made kind of wrong question.
Great. I have actually another question. If nobody has other questions. Well, actually, I have one question. Maybe I'm gonna share screen a little bit because it's about one of the particular work. So yeah, this is the one I think that you're seeing right now on the screen. So this is like it's one chapter from the material witness, but this work is called Evidence on Trial. Probably you remember. And to kind of make it clear, this work is I believe it's constituted with those like many of different kind of footages that's been submitted to trial, I believe in history. And it's like a collection of those like footages. But I was wondering if I think this question could be applicable to the work of forensic architecture too, but I was wondering if I were the artist of this work, I would probably suffer between two different qualities of each footages. I think one aspect is how much validity it has as an evidential material, like how strong it is as an evidence. Another quality is like aesthetic, how aesthetically beautiful that you believe it is. And I think, as an artistic researcher or like someone who engages in like investigative artistic practices, I think this struggle is always a concern, I guess. And I was wondering how you deal with that during your practice.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. It's a struggle, and it's something that comes up time and time again because, like aesthetics, both for myself and forensic architecture. So of course aesthetics matters, and the aesthetic is one of the tools of persuasion that are used to produce a kind of convincing kind of claim. Now, people have asked, you're producing these aesthetic images of like contexts that are like in crisis, and they go, yeah, of course that's the case. The solution isn't to produce ugly or unappealing images either, but it's I think it's just this constant sort of friction. I mean, I guess what, I don't have like a perfect answer to this question, to be quite honest, because in some way, in many of the works that I'm doing, like the aesthetic register is also the carrier of a particular kind of information and requires a particular kind of like sensor. So, like carbon deposits on snow that produce these amazing, on some level, you go, it's an amazing landscape where you see a kind of, like an icy geography that's sort of somehow black. And you go, like on an aesthetic level, it's really a powerful kind of image. But we can't just stay with that image in the way that someone like Edward Bertinsky, the Canadian sort of photographer who produces these large format camera-based documents of extractivist practices all over the world. I can't just stay there. The aesthetic is it's a lure, it's a way to organize, structure the material, but the material ultimately has to take us somewhere else. It has to start to do really kind of political work by unfolding and telling a particular kind of story, or narrating a story, or producing a sequence of events. I mean, the image that's on the screen there, Evidence on Trial, in a strange way, I'd say that's a bit different, because these are the materials that the court themselves has produced. And the reason it's on these, what is that, 16 monitors is because the court, over the 20 plus years of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, also went through this technical transformation from monitors to flat screens. That happened closer to the end of the life of the tribunal, but I wanted to use the materials, the cameras of the court have shot all these materials, and I wanted to also present them on the technology that's also sort of used in the court. So in some way, the aesthetics in an operation in an image like that is produced by the legal machinery of the court itself. And it's the aesthetic language, the point of view, the angle, the duration of shots, let's say the color cast. That's all a consequence of the court's own technological infrastructure. So we really can read in some way the materiality, the aesthetic materiality of the court, in the way that the court itself, as I argued in the Material Witness book, is a process. It's processing materials that enter into it as evidence, and this is what this piece focuses on, but it also gives us insight into this sort of event of evidence. And so we can also see through watching these particular videos the ways in which the court itself is transforming a lot of the materials that are presented. So this is I'd say a bit slightly more anomalous, because it has less to do with my own development of an aesthetic language, where my other documentaries, I've given you, too long an answer, but what I think it's important to say is that I recognized in the filming that I was doing in different environments, including when I was in Japan. I didn't show that, but I was filming in and around Fukushima Daiichi a couple years after. But all those materials, like, I felt that my visual language in some way looked rather conventional, and that I had to use sound to denaturalize those kind of images. So to me, the aesthetics in my work, sometimes we could say, produce a certain familiarity from a certain kind of nature documentary tradition. And I need to somehow subvert that convention through the introduction of sound that troubles the way in which that image is both sort of familiar and seemingly conventional. So I have been using sound to say, okay, something, not everything is not okay in what looks like a very stable image of the world. So in some way, the aesthetic convention brings us into a kind of certain history of the production of these kinds of images that also then needs to be troubled through either through the sort of narration that I'm trying to build, or the ways in which sound is reintroduced to bring us into another sort of effectual kind of register. But the short answer is it's a continual kind of struggle, because I don't believe the solution is to simply produce an image that is sort of somehow not carefully considered, composed, etc., that lacks a certain kind of like aesthetic virtuosity. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your answer kind of reminds me of the book I was like regarding the pain of the others by Susan Sontag, like how kind of we always react to this kind of like a pleasure of the like visualizing or a kind of seeing those like catastrophe from really far away, but there's always a kind of trap to it. But it's like a constant struggle as an artist how to deal with that. Like as you said, probably like the sound or multisensory experience would be one strategy of kind of like I don't know, evade like getting away from that. Or I'm also struggling as well, and it was very nice to hear your answer. Thank you. I guess it's already 7:10, so I was wondering maybe we can have 10 minutes break somewhere here. Great. Can we come back in 7:20 Japan time? So I would say it's 10:20 your time, probably GMT.
Sure, that sounds fine.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll see you later then.
Okay.
Thank you. See you soon.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
Okay, so maybe shall we restart? It's 7:20 here. Great. Okay, so I think now you can see like all the artists plus the some views of the audience, probably. Great.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so maybe the latter half of the talk, I think maybe we can introduce some of the artists' work here, and then we can move on to a discussion like of the concept of material witness in relation to this exhibition, probably. So maybe you can start in the beginning, Iden.
Yes, thank you. Hello, my name is Iden, and I'm artist, researcher, writer, and educator currently based in Germany and Korea. I'm mostly focusing on politically polarized discourse and technical development via diachronic viewfinder, and mostly in big science and big research, which multinational interest parties involved in political complexity and inconsistence can never stay politically value neutral, like nuclear research, medical research, and data ethics. Next slide. You can share the screen. Sorry.
Sorry, maybe if you want to do it yourself, that's
Oh.
if that's it. I thought that's the reason that you joined, or like.
No.
Either
it's
way, okay,
more-
sure, yeah, okay, I can do it myself.
Thank you. It's just more
Yeah,
like
sure.
easier
Wait, yeah,
when we have a control tower.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
So this is the slide. Yeah.
This is a
I hope
slide.
everyone can see it.
Yeah,
Perfect.
perfect.
Yep.
So the work I'm currently exhibiting is based on long-term research project in cooperation with Archive Center of Nuclear Research Center at Karlsruhe Institute for Technology, which is the first center after the World War II without military intention. And we got full access and could bring on artistic interpretation on archival research from the perspective of diachronic research throughout the first archive, which has already got through a specific perspective, specifically by archivists. And I myself, as the person investigating this first archive and intertwine on narrative out of this written history. And furthermore, the next slide, had an opportunity to document demolishing site of Nuclear Research Center as embodied witnessing. And next slide. And as myself, how to rewrite and write diachronic history of political discourse in nuclear research. And the next slide is the first work I've developed out of this project. I investigated press photos and contracts from 60s until 90s between institutions and countries to follow which academic, economic, and political dynamic were written and archived, and tangle with the question, what should be written and remembered? And this selective process in archive is framed, pivot in collective and cultural memory, and moreover in history. And I position myself in this project as an investigator dealing with second archive. So next slide is the exhibition view at demolished nuclear power plant in Germany, and also in the next time also Sweden. I took digitalized archival materials on analog diafilm as methodological metaphor on photography as time-based media. So it serves as physical witnessing inside of actual sites related to the whole research. So the next slide, so visitors can see through the window of hot cell, it's called hot cell, where the nuclear cylinder is getting cold. Yeah, so the next project is then this is the next project from the previous one. This is with title Footnotes Ground Zero in 2018, consisting of diachronic narrative from archive from 60s, also from 90, inclusive interviews from Robert Oppenheimer and also archivists in 20s and 80s against atomic weapon, and Donald Trump in 90. and my video footage from the nuclear power plant in Sweden. So basically, whole materials and researchers are entangled with continuous narrative and political discourse, especially about historical repetition of polarization, which is verbally inherited history of my grandparents' generation after the Japanese occupation ceased with atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So next slide. So this is the screenshot from the video, and on the next slide is the installation view in Germany from 2018, which you can see in South Gallery as well. And the next slide is also combined with the installation work and documentary photo from the demolishing nuclear center. So this whole project intertwines into political, ecological discourse in nuclear research and as artistic research as political practice. So the next slide is the current view of the exhibition in Kyoto Art Center. So here is the entrance corridor with my photographic works, and the next slide is inside of the South Gallery with my work Photos to Ground Zero, with publication is been exhibiting, especially in the next slide. The next one, thank you. So especially horn speakers often used as a symbol of political propaganda, and this is kind of visual metaphor in the installation, how discourse in the nuclear power and nuclear research is often polarized now in the situation of the war. And also with a publication where many artists and researchers are contributed. And here our today's talk guest, Susan Schuppli, is also one of our contributors. Yeah, next slide. So there's also with through analog TV with archival materials from National Archive. Yeah, and so just a second. Yeah, I think it's done. Yeah, thank you. So during this exhibition, there was the first premiere of my lecture performance contemplating current political conflicts, Russian invasion, and genocide in Gaza. I myself, as third-generation child of colonial history, now living in Europe, who is experiencing this multinational structure of violence, and this performance is conceptualized as political stand-up comedy. Still, this is also work in progress. So every performance is different, but here are some quotes as base proposition. Is the next slide. Especially to interviews from scientists involved in Manhattan Project, who actually have different approach and position on nuclear research and nuclear weapon. You might definitely see how different their position is politically. And yeah, this whole project was started in 2017, and actually I ended up having a break last year, but after visiting Fukushima, and from today I'm gonna heading to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to make a site research and collecting materials, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again with new project as well.
Great, thank you, Iden, for your presentation. Yeah, is there any maybe is there any feedback you could provide, Susan? Because I think you guys have a lot of interesting comments, such as the nuclear research, or that you've. What was about the publication? So you guys have published this paper in the same publication, or?
This publication started from the collaboration with the Archive Center, and we student group in supervision of Professor Susan Schuppli. We investigated the archival materials, the center, and fully assessed to from 50s until current period. And then we researched this material from our own viewfinder. So another artists and also students have kind of really different approach. And there's also researcher and historian that also dealing with political discourse and atomic research. And Susan wrote a really beautiful contribution about her project with ICE, which I personally really impressed of. So this is basically the collaboration between many other disciplines, but basically on the only 10% digitalized archive and how we actually concern about the political discourse, but not only political discourse, but also how actually history, through the written history, this is actually rewritten when it comes to nuclear research.
Mhm.
It was an amazing project. I really pleasant.
I mean, I have a question for you,
Yes.
living in Germany, then, because it strikes me with the war in the Ukraine, it was kind of both amazing but also not surprising that the discussion around like dependency on Russian oil, how quickly the specter of the nuclear came back as like a way for nation states to develop their domestic energy kind of like reserves, and how I don't know whether you had the same sort of response, but you really, in those moments, you just understand how how the sort of political register in some ways is just completely like how a certain kind of new political sort of situation just disavows all of the ways in which the debates around the nuclear had unfolded, including in countries like Germany, etc. I was just curious about your perception because despite the sort of decade-long sort of activism and all of the kind of cataclysmic consequences of nuclear accidents, when you have something like something else, another event, in this case, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and say Western dependency on, and in Germany in particular, on Russian oil and gas infrastructures, how the nuclear then somehow holds out a kind of promise and really disavows the sort of the kind of legacies of activism and contestation and that have been, have been part of that story for so sort of long. I was just curious about your own thinking or response to the sort of way in which the nuclear reemerges as almost as a kind of benign sort of force, if you will.
Sure, of course. I should also confess myself that I'm more rather spectator and also witness, not as an activist. Of course, I have also my own political position, but I've experienced a lot of different political discourses and also position throughout different disciplines, not only from the ecological discourse, but also economical and socio-political and so on. When it comes to Germany, I think it is not only about Germany, but generally international. Every country's actually involved in this kind of multinational complexity in politics, that such kind of energy it's also connected with the energy exploitation, of course, that every countries and every economical structures are now hyper-connected between each others. I think this whole historical repetition is definitely coming around, and I think personally the situation in Germany is somehow really complex to express my own opinion, because I definitely also have blind spots when it comes to international politics and energy crisis, ecological discourse, and so on. So I might say I'm more rather gonna follow how the situation now changes. And as an artist, I'd like to collect and also witness this situation through my own viewfinder as a person from another countries, which is also kind of impacted by political discourse after World War II. I'm not really sure whether I respond in the right way on your question, Susan.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I guess I was just sort of making the point that these moments where you realize the nuclear has always been first and foremost political before it's been anything else. I wasn't quite clear. Sorry, maybe I didn't catch it properly. What was the role? Why was Donald Trump referenced in your presentation?
Oh, that is a really interesting part. The interview from Donald Trump, so this is a 20-second slide. That was actually from 90, and in this interview he declared about the conflict between South and North Korea when it comes to atomic weapon. In that period, North Korea developed on missile system and also atomic research and atomic weapon. There was most like the first phase of this political discourse between these two countries, and he declared that that there's a political discourse and situation in Korea is one of the most threatened factor to the U.S. too, and this is still from 90. This was 1992, and then the conflict between South and North Korea when it comes to atomic weapon was actually 2018. So it is almost after 25 years, and then at that moment the president was also Donald Trump, and I think this diachronic investigation through the archival materials and that implementation of my current situation in my home country, it was more resonate with how actually historical reputation is still around, even we think the political structure and economic structure is now different, but basically the history is exactly same.
Oh, great. No, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eden. Thank you, Susan. Maybe we can move on to Vivian's artist talk in a little bit. I'm going to share, stop the share screen a little bit, and then maybe you can try. Yeah. Perfect.
Hello. Hi, my name is Celeste, and I'm an artist based in London, currently doing interdisciplinary research regarding biotechnological processes, futurity, science, and also sort of speculative narratives and how it sort of interweaves each other, like in the form of like in dialogue with diasporic life world and also the techno-scientific imaginary. And I often sort of approach the research through the study of spaces, or rather non-places, in the kind of agencies that's more than human, that's involved in those like processes of becoming, and also like through the investigation of like registers of harm and synergy on the body. And so for this exhibition, I sort of work, it's sort of like a part of this long-term research projects that has been done on this, like in my research on cryopreservation and like freezing as an archival and empirical method, and transnational logistics, and also specific events that sort of refracts, like in a larger sense, like through to this like Sisyphean cycle of labor and transportation, violence, and also displacement. So it all sort of started in 2021, where I was investigating this Essex lorry, refrigerator lorry incident, and also like the private and the kind of contrast with how cryofreezing has been utilized, or rather instrumentalized in private cryonic organizations. But I'll circle back to it if we have time. I'll focus on the work for this exhibition. So for this one, for this work, I was like, it's like a site-specific sonic sculptural installation that sort of take place in between the two gallery spaces at Kyoto Art Center, which where the two architectural disjoint adjacent spaces are sort of connected through the element of sound, where the viewers are like sort of kind of their interaction with the work sort of comes into become part of the work. And specifically, it is through sorry, just a second. Yeah. So it sort of like involves the transformation of the material cycle of water and ice, its instrumentation and a weaponization. So the sort of work is sort of developed from the same research, but also kind of on the artifacts and their residual effects as hyperobjects, and sort of examining those like real life incidents that I'm gonna detail in a bit, in their effects echoed in their temporal latencies. So I'm just gonna go through the slides maybe very quickly, I guess. And so this is the sort of, I sort of did like a very short recording of how the different elements of the work sort of comes into play. I'm not sure if like you can hear the audio, but the video is on YouTube. And so like the icicle were sort of like dripping water. The icicle are made with like water that's sourced locally, and also sort of intermixed with the field recordings I sort of recorded on the Fukushima research trip. So like the icicle were sort of, yeah, dripping water into the tray, and like the sound of dripping was sort of collected through this underwater microphone, and also the sort of the audience like interaction with the work in the other gallery. So this work was exhibited in the North Gallery, and the interaction with the work in the South Gallery was sort of like footsteps and conversations were being collected through a condenser mic that's connected between the two galleries. And I'm gonna go back to the presentation. Yeah, so let's see. Yeah, so this work is sort of kind of like when I was doing research regarding like how sort of like my inquiries into like how certain like standalone cases of humanitarian crisis, and like also specific cases of like tragic incidents, and like how it sort of relate to and amplify our collective understanding of the cryopolitical, sort of related to thermopolitics, in which like how temperature experiences and effects are interwoven with like human rights violations, legal issues, and colonial legacies. In certain scenarios, code is instrumentalized to control and persecute individuals and targeted communities. So in this work, I was like coming across, so these are sort of incidents that sort of unfold in real time as I was like doing my ongoing research, and like in the events of like between, in summary, it's like in the events sort of happened between Yakutsk and Magadan, there was like an Russian driver who was frozen to death on the way between the two cities because he was misled by Google Maps that sort of like in the lands of Siberia, which directed him onto the Road of Bones that's no longer used. The Road of Bones was built in the Joseph Stalin era by political prisoners, where 250,000 people died during its construction. It's sort of eerie, like how after so many decades, like this sort of evidence of harm is sort of still sort of capable of victimizing individuals in sort of unexpected ways. It's so sort of, and also in a sort of uncanny parallel of its like material process of like freezing, and becomes like a sort of like this sort of origin of all of these causes. Like in the at moments before the Fukushima nuclear explosion, cooling process was supposed to be implemented in an attempt to ward off the detonation that was sort of affected by the tsunami, but the loss of the reactor core cooling resulted from the tsunami flooding led to the nuclear meltdowns, and also the release of radioactive contamination. Water was subsequently used to extract, to contain the nuclear waste, but the water was sort of, the leakage was reported throughout the years in the aftermath in the explosion. So in this work, it sort of explores how the two incidents on drastically different spatial temporal scales are sort of like transtemporally connected through the medium of water and the technological process of freezing. And the installation sort of functions as sort of the midpoint, which is sort of referenced in its title, which takes the sort of midpoint coordinates where the incidents reference were located, and also the location of the work that's currently shown in Kyoto. It is triggered by the presence of people navigating the sort of space, the two different spaces between the galleries, and also sort of echoing the liminal land where the driver sort of found himself between the two cities and frozen to death, and the temporal space between the catastrophe and rehabilitation that many like nuclear disaster sites are frozen in. And also the recordings at the nuclear site, this sound of freezing, and also the real-time generated sound from the temperature transducers that's attached to the ice sculpture parts produced from the transformation of like cycle of water. So sort of in this work, I see ice as sort of source for its amorphous quality, ubiquity, like malleability, and its transformation of states as like sort of requisite for its rapidization. Seeing that ice is sort of unexpected and invisible, sort of like between transparent and translucent, and yet like lethal and traceable instrument, I feel like it sort of references and gives new meaning to the notion of be like water in like the rhetorics of like dueling and also liquidation. And in such ways, like the words produced sort of parallels the futility of bodies, the resistance against, and also the defense of them on a larger scale, revealing and integrating with its Sisyphean cycle. So I think in those cases where certain like procedural, biotechnological, bodily-oriented processes are by their symbolic function are not just used or in close words, but also existing outside the medical institutions as well in the more subtle and ubiquitous forms of like state or rather public sanctioned brutality. And so the way how like the ice is sort of shown or exhibited is also sort of referencing the process of cryopreservation, like ice as weapons, water or ice as weapons, and also the act of putting a stake through the heart, like in the subjugation of the other, like in quite like folklores, where like sort of it also the way how the water is dripping is also paralleling the Asian water torture or called like dripping machine, and become both like a weapon lethal by its potentiality and also the drowned body of the victimized. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna hurry up and like yeah. So so in this word it's sort of like, and also I'm just gonna go through the slides, and that's where the temperature transducer was attached, like when the icicle is up. So then it's like attached to the back of the icicle, and this is where the water is dripping. I'm just gonna quickly go through the slides. And specifically, like metal pieces made through the process of water casting was also shown like as part of the installation. Where, so this is the Raspberry Pi and like the sound mixture, and the video of like transporting the water from the coast from like a previous part of the research project. And the reason why like metal pieces were involved is because like I was like doing research and also like making like kind of like collecting those like locally sourced pond water from Kyoto, and the how the metal was taken form is through melting them, and also like through the process of water casting, which sort of make visible of like the different parameters of the water that's like its temperature, humidity, and also the contamination level. Because like we were sort of using Geiger counter in Fukushima, but also in Kyoto as well. And then we sort of found out that like the contamination level in Kyoto is much higher comparing to other parts of the world, like in Germany or in the UK. So we can see how this sort of radiation level is sort of ripples through this kind of like geographical proximity, which makes it even more I think in more like there's being invisible and like being like areas being declared safe, and yet there's still some parts of like traces or remnants of it that's still very much visible. So this is like the floor plan and also the work that's part previously that's been like water that's been transported away from the coast to UK for another work. Yeah, so I see that there's also like in the work is sort of the process sort of parallels the transportation of something that's from the afterlife into like the living or the in-between, where the performers sort of become both the courier and also the witness of life that's been having like a last respite before going into eternal rest. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, it's very interesting too, because I've seen your work many times, but it's really always interesting to listen to like the thoughts behind it. I was wondering if there's, because I see there's so many like similarities with like the implementation of ice and like the how you perceive body of water in a way. I was wondering if any feedback that Susan can provide.
I mean, one thing, well, the first thing I would say is I worked on a series of cold cases that looked at the weaponization of temperature, collaborations with forensic architecture. You may or may not know those projects, but and they looked at freezing deaths, so the use of cold to kill Indigenous people in Canada as a clandestine form of policing. The use of water hoses at Standing Rock in sub-zero temperatures where 300 people were afflicted with hypothermia, and then icebox detention, which is a practice of the whereby migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border are put into these temporary holding cells that are often deliberately the thermostats are turned down to try as a form of kind of punishment. So when I think about weaponization of temperature, I think about something that is an ambient condition that it's basically like, the hostile environment sort of policy of the UK government, where, you're using something that as in some way, in an instrumental way, but against bodies, and those bodies are often racialized peoples to inflict a certain kind of harm. This is the way that I tend to think about the weaponization of temperature. So I wouldn't, for me, when Google Maps sends somebody, and there's many, many examples of this, where people have like driven into lakes, or just Google Map doesn't sync up with the real world reality and people get lost. There's been a number of cases of not always freezing to death, but hypothermia, because they also don't use their common sense. They just go down a road that isn't a road, this kind of thing. I'm not sure I would call that weaponization of temperature personally, because when something is weaponized, there's an intentional use of something in order to inflict a harm. Like a weapon is an instrument of violence that inflicts some sort of I'd say harm. It could be against a body or a group of people or an environmental system, but it's, to me, the Google Earth, the Google mapping is more a kind of like the ways in which, data doesn't always sync up with real world conditions on the ground. And it really demonstrates the over-reliance that people have on some of these digital tools, to the point where sometimes like common sense would have actually been a much better way to sort of make a decision. I think I'd need a bit of clarity. I mean, when you say that icicle is like, do you mean because it looks like a triangular shape? It looks like something you could stab someone with? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of the shape is sort of comes in the nexus of like a lot of sources. Like one being that I think there's always like all year round, like especially in cold environments where people have been very tragically but also ironically been killed due to the natural presence of icicles, but also because of its particular shape, it's been sort of recognized in a way that it somehow functions as a sort of invisible weapon that sort of due to its very particular qualities, able to sort of lends people alibi in a way that's like part of its sort of non-human agency. That's sort of like, yeah, and also its particular shape is sort of like shaping like the like a stake that's often present in those like lures of like killing a very like preternatural like non-human other like through this action of like a stake to the heart. So like it's sort of like its shape is sort of like a congregation of like all these different like sources of like information, yet it becomes sort of like materially and symbolically sort of loaded in its potentiality and its like capability of an action. Like even during the exhibition period, there's always the risk of the icicle potentially like falling straight down and then like scare like the viewers potentially. I feel like that's also something that sort of comes into play inevitably due to its the elements of risk as well. Yeah.
I see. I mean, I thought, did I read in your slides that you grew up in Washington State? No.
No, it's more of like a congregation of like different places. So I was born in Seattle, but I throughout the years I also like lived in Hong Kong briefly, and also Shanghai and Michigan, and also London for the last 6 years. So I'm kind of like, so in my work I sort of like not in this work but in previous work, as I referenced the refrigerator to Laura incident, the way how I sort of why it sort of become like something that started the researchers also because I resonate strongly with the sort of precarity and also displacement that's inherent to those kind of like diasporic conditions of living, and also this sort of drifting sense of identity and being.
Oh, okay. No, I only asked that because as a child, I grew up in Canada, and we had tons of these massive icicles. Like, we loved those icicles, and we would knock them down. Like, they weren't weapons. We were like, we'd play with them. They were like popsicles, but they were these huge things. Yes, I mean, you hear these stories, like, you know, like it's pretty rare for someone to die from being stabbed by an icicle. Like, I think the strangeness of the icicle for people who are not familiar could conjure this. It looks a bit like, yeah, it could look like something that could stab you, but people who actually live with icicles don't have that kind of, I don't think it functions in the same way. It's just part of the ways in which the dynamics of hot and cold melt to produce this sort of condition, and you're always knocking them off your eaves troughs and your roof. I mean, I'm just saying that in what maybe in London, seeing that shape would be more menacing, but where I grew up, you would never read that as a knife or something that could kill you. It was much more a kind of beautiful thing that was, sometimes you're just in awe of the amazing, they could be like 3 meters long hanging off the edge of your roof, and then eventually they fall down. But as kids, we would use them just to play with these things all the time. So I do think context really matters when you're working on something like the politics of cold, or as that's the way that I refer to it, or that you're working with the materiality of ice, because yeah, like people who live and work on ice might have a very different relationship to the material than in another context where an artist, I mean, this is the task of artists, is to create these sort of imaginative, wondrous sort of worlds, and you defamiliarize someone with something that's in another context would be kind of very sort of familiar. So yeah, I mean, that would be sort of my comments. I find more the I don't know if I need that sort of menacing like quality to appreciate the installation. That seems more about like this sort of like the sonic, the technical, just a kind of strange object that's very simple. It's just frozen water that can produce this whole kind of complex set of relations. But yeah, I mean, those are sort of my immediate comments. But I mean, the one thing I feel, Celeste, is like, or it would be a question, do you write all this? Because you gave us a very complex set of explanations for all of the ideas that inform your work. Does that usually, where do we find that? Is that in writing, or do you expect us to have insight to all of that when we encounter your work?
Yeah, I feel like it's something like, thank you for your comments, very insightful. Like, I feel like it's something regarding like how writing sort of also sort of comes into my artistic practice. I feel like for me it's sort of like a little bit of a like dichotomic sort of relation between the two, and also like it's something that I'm constantly struggling with, like in terms of like how there's this aspect of my work. I feel like most of my work sort of comes from a place of writing, and then it's sort of gradually migrated into like the visual language in a way. But I always felt like writing somehow is like more closer to home in terms of how I explore my research, and also the way how I sort of join together like those different like subject matter, and sort of in terms of like refraction of like the kind of macrocosms that we live in. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, actually, we're already 5 minutes later than 8, so maybe we can move on to a short Q&A and then we can finish the talk probably. I have actually one question I really wanted to ask to Susan, if anybody else, if
Sure.
that's all right. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna share screen briefly because
Right
this,
before you, I don't, right now, it's weird. I can only see that graphic that,
do you see this?
it-
Do you see a different screen now, or is it?
well, I guess because you're still screen sharing
Yeah,
the
yeah.
slides.
I think right now, do you see the photo of Mr. Taro Igarashi, or like is it like
Yeah, I see that now. Yeah,
perfect?
thanks.
Great. Yeah, yeah. So this has been an ongoing discussion as a collective, and we've been discussing it since the first talk that we had with Mr. Taro Igarashi, who's an architectural critic and also who's a former director of IT Triennale. But so in relation to the discussion we had with him, we kind of like we talked about the limitations and possibilities of the current waves of investigative artistic practices. And during the discussion, we have created this kind of diagram in a way. So so the first term on the right-hand side is called the limitation of artistic research. This and also the information overload. This comes from a discussion conducted by a British art critic, Claire Bishop, who criticizes like a current trends of artistic researchers, saying that they depend large part of their research upon virtual methods without actually visiting their research target nor performatively engaging themselves in an embodied research. So the outcome of the research often lacks an ontological or an autobiographical register to indicate where they are speaking from actually. So that was one of her point. It was on Art Forum. This is like one struggle that we always have. And then, then another side, there's also artistic practices like forensic architecture. And I think the significance of forensic architecture lies in the kind of how they provide this kind of vast visuality that is not usually accessible to most of the citizens, I guess. So they collect lots of footages, details, and everything from lots of collaborators from the world. I don't think they always go to their site by themselves, but they have this kind of power to create this very detailed visual virtual scape in a way. And I think that's that could be positioned as one side. And the last thing that we've talked about is the sentence goes, an embedded inability of sharing or articulating traumas. And here I'd like to reference a writing by Mari Oka. She's a professor of Kyoto University, and her research area is a third world feminism. But in this book called Memory/Narrative, she talks about this writing by Jean-Pierre Jeunet. It's called 4 Hours in Shatila. And in that writing, she points out that, Jean Jeunet actually visits Shatila and he travels and wanders around in those debris. But what he writes is it's always what he sees is always, it's incomplete, he's actually there and he's walking around, but he's always pointed out by someone else on site that he's not seeing anything. There's the guy who's right next to him says oh, look at this, look at this in details, and then he realizes how much he isn't actually seeing anything. That's the kind of difficulty of actually sharing the trauma in the face of such grave catastrophe or sadness. It's really difficult to kind of understand it as an outsider. And I think what we are trying to do is somewhere in the middle of those three triangle contradicting with each other. And I was wondering if you are to position yourself, where would you situate yourself in this kind of dilemmas?
Yeah, I don't really know. One thing it's important to say that forensic architecture would never say that they're engaged in making art, and they're not artists. And when the investigations go into galleries, they call them cases or something.
Right.
They're mobilized in the art world because I think the art world has an interest in relevant, like aesthetically interesting forms of like research, but they are not ever from inside the agency. We don't call those artworks, for sure not, because
Right.
I don't even think they're interesting as art, to be perfect. If I was really honest, I think maybe I'm not answering your question, but I for me, forensic architecture has to be accountable for every decision that is made. So yes, I think you do get information overload. You know, this line, this purple line connecting this to this represents the route that the bus with the children takes. The yellow, this is where the police were stationed. All this kind of explanation that is part of every case. I don't personally think that makes always for an interesting aesthetic experience. I think you need, personally, an artwork can also have like huge gaps, silences, internal contradictions. To me, that's what makes an artwork interesting, is not that every decision is fully like reverse engineered and we know exactly what the significance of this dot or this line or this image or like, I mean, aesthetic, don't get me wrong, I think the investigations are really fascinating, especially when, you know, you use a timeline to slow things down, or you use sound to model a prison in Syria. And so the acoustic memories of witnesses become a way to rebuild these sort of spatial architectures. I think it's incredibly kind of fascinating. But I do think that critique of Claire Bishop in terms of information overload, there is some validity. And I think, so personally, I can be much more as an artist. I have a lot of materials in my archive and I use them quite freely for whatever purposes I need them to. In some cases, they're not, I'm actually being quite fast and loose, I would say, I might have shot this material of this glacier in India, but I'm doing something else and I need an image, and I go, well, I'll just bring that in because it helps me tell the story, even though it's coming from an entirely different context. I give myself that artistic license to freely work with my archive and not to feel that everything has to be evidentially accurate. This is in my creative practice. Because I need materials. Materials for me in my art practice are always proxies. They're proxies. They're proxies that have to stand in for something that might be 1,000 years old or 1.5 million years old. So I need things that can be proxies to help me tell these stories. I agree with Claire Bishop to some point. Like, one thing I would say, I've seen a lot of exhibitions where artists put like documents in vitrines, and I go like, that is a completely meaningless gesture to me, because it's just a sign that this is somehow complicated or that the artist has done a lot of research. But you can't even, I remember having this feeling when I saw the Forma Fantasma at the Serpentine and all these documents were under glass, and going, well, what are we supposed to do with that? We can't even flip through them and look at some of these reports because they're in a vitrine. I don't think we should be using like the signs of research, so large piles of paper, or, you know, like somehow I think that doesn't work for me. And so I think that's a strategy that is used a lot, is where something that looks abstract and complex is supposed to stand in as a sign of deep research. I feel that our artistic practices need to unfold things rather than sort of fetishize the sort of the hermeneutic qualities of something that keep it kind of closed, like, and black boxed, you know, like that's what I feel that sometimes that this sort of like the black boxing that we're all very critical of sometimes gets reinscribed in the way in which an art installation is actually like presented. It's not an easy thing to do, and I'm sure I've done that kind of stuff myself. And in evidence and trial, there's a lot of documents that appear on screen, but those other 15 videos in relationship to that are somehow supposed to help us understand what's at stake in that document. But so yeah, I did read Claire Bishop's. I also thought it was lacking in generosity, because I think that the world of artistic research is relatively new. It's really allowed other kinds of artists to enter into the conversation, not just the sort of, like artists who come out of different intellectual traditions where there wasn't historically space for that kind of person who has a more research-based sort of inquiry, rather than someone who's just working on sort of, let's say, formal concerns, or like has a highly experimental conceptual kind of practice. There wasn't really space for that kind of artist. There isn't really in the UK. Hakeve in Germany, Haus der Kultur in der Welt, was pretty good at having a lot of research-based exhibitions. The commercial art world that sort of runs London is still not fully on board, I would say. So I do think it's a bit ungenerous, but it's a polemical text. So I have opinions about those three. I'm not sure. I don't know where. I guess I'm somewhere caught up in between those three areas, I would say.
Right.
Between the investigative, the attempt to produce, what are the visual strategies we can develop to produce research exhibitions? I don't know. It's a huge challenge. I don't think we figured that out yet.
Yeah. Can I ask about what would you think about this kind of like a trap of, how do you call it? Because I think when forensic architecture creates this very detailed like a visual model and it projects it into a museum or something, like we kind of the audience tend to misunderstand that they've seen everything, even though they are so far from the actual site and are so far from the personalities or like what is actually happening on site. But then I feel like there's this kind of trap of like this pleasure of visibility in a way, and I just often compare that with this kind of like the actual like inability of sharing or articulating traumas. And I was wondering, what's your opinion about that? Is there anything to do with how you are kind of going into this like a soundscapes or like multisensory medias, or like you would say it's something else?
No, I do think you're right. This is like a very crass kind of like when I was at the ICA exhibition, Forensic Architecture did some years ago, I actually, at the opening, I overheard this one person. She was in the section dealing with the death of migrants at sea that Lorenzo and Charles, who started forensic oceanography, it was that sort of that section of the exhibition at the Institute for Contemporary Art here in London. And I heard someone beside me say, "Oh, I love anything to do with water and boats." And I thought, this is what a ridiculous comment. We're talking about like people who are dying because of like they're trying to flee the war zones of Syria. But so the art world can, at that moment I realized, for some people, this is just an interesting set of aesthetic maneuvers that really isn't registering as a kind of like, as a representation or expression of a very situated traumatic event. It's purely being consumed at a very superficial level. So I think that's the worst end of the spectrum. There's other people who are deeply moved because they, for the first time, in Mexico, we could say for the first time ever, there was a space created in public where their pain becomes part of a larger set of operations, was given sort of like an incredible amount of attention, care. Forensic architecture will take a year to do an investigation. So that really careful work, working with communities, that's incredibly empowering for people who are involved. And then to have that work appear in a public space like an art gallery And in Mexico City, the judge in the case was really using the artwork. Sorry, now I'm calling it artwork. He was using the art exhibition to narrate this complex story of the missing students that he was sort of involved with. So there's an example at the other end of the spectrum where, for the people who have direct experiences and stakes in a given investigation, then it's like incredibly important. And the same was true for the war in the Babylon, once again at the ICA with the Black communities in London. Having a major cultural institution take seriously the collective pain of Black communities in Britain was really, really empowering. And because usually that kind of like experience is so marginalized. So I do think that it can work across a kind of spectrum, from people who are simply like consumers to people who have deep personal kind of stakes. And for others, it's kind of, they find it a really interesting way to, it's part of a new mode of journalism that's called digital storytelling. So other people find the methods that forensic architecture develops, such as the use of clouds to tell time and the cloud studies, just really conceptually exciting as methods of conducting research where you don't have like access to information. How do you find something out when the sort of normative modes of getting information about something doesn't exist, or you can't access that space because of like the politics on the ground, or there's a lot of obstacles or prohibitions in the way. So I think there's a whole kind of range, but I do think the art world, and I'm part of the art world, has really been interested in forensic architecture because they can say, oh, their work is really meaningful, it's political, plus it is really aesthetically convincing and interesting. And so I think, so that the art world might look at it from that perspective. Now, we in the agency also use museums to generate money to conduct investigations, right? So, and a cultural organization might say, we're interested in showing FA, and the response would be, yes, but then you have to fund this investigation that we're interested in doing. You have to commit to archiving all the research materials in perpetuity. This is what the V&A is doing, for example. So an NGO like Forensic Architecture can also use other aspects of a museum or a gallery to raise funds to archive all of their digital sort of like investigative materials, because we don't have capacity to do that in-house. So it's a more complex relationship, I would say.
Thank you so much for answering such like conceptual questions. It's really interesting to know, because I wasn't expecting this, but like, yeah, it's really interesting to know how, because we tend to forget that forensic architecture is actually an NGO, and it's working or like fundraised by sometimes museums, particular museums or institutions or something like that. But it's really insightful, very much insightful to know that. And yeah, is there any other questions or anything else? Okay, I think we can close the talk then. Thank you so much for coming here today, Susan, and everyone in the audience. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you, and have a lovely day. Right? I think it's in the UK. It's in the morning.
Well, it's 11:20, so it's getting
right.
to London.
Sure. Thank you so much. I hope to
Well,
see you soon. Yeah.
But yeah, let me know when you're in London and we can catch up.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you so much. Okay, see you.
Thank you. Okay, bye to everybody.
Bye.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.